Okay, so again, my name is Dave Peaty. I am the board president of Publishing Professionals Network. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit, and we serve mainly to bring out excellence in making books, but also to support the book making industry, publishing in general. And we are an amazing community, and we hope that if you're here and you're not a PPN member, you'll think about joining. The costs are very minimal, and if you have any hurdles, I hope you'll reach out to us, and I'm sure we can make it work. I am joined tonight by a fellow board member, Peter Goodman. He is going to be helping me on the Zoom. I'm assuming at this point that everyone is pretty Zoom savvy, that you know how to work the chat. You know how to raise your hand if and when that time comes, and that you can know how to chat with other people. So I'm really excited because I see a bunch of people that I'm familiar with, but I'm seeing a ton of people that I'm not familiar with. So I'm very excited about that. We're going to save the Q&A until the end and put it in the chat. We probably would have set this up as a webinar if we had known this many people were coming, but we didn't. So it's just a really big Zoom session. I recommend that all of you feel free to chime in on the chat, take this time to do a little networking if you want. Save the Q&A toward the end, because it'll prevent us from having to scroll back too far to try to sort of figure out who had a question 20 minutes back in the chat screen. Again, thank you all for coming. If you are having any technical issues, Peter is going to be looking through the chat. I see some people say that they're having some sound issues. I'm going to ask Peter and Thomas to raise their hand if they can hear me. Okay, so I think if you're having sound issues, it's probably at your end, I'm sorry to say, and not anything that we're going to be able to help you with. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about Publishing Professionals Network. I told you basically that we're a nonprofit, but I want to talk about some of the things that we do. In October, we are having our 50th book show. It's quite a milestone for us. We're really excited about it. It is an in-person event in San Francisco, hosted at Chronicle Books. You can find out about it on our website. Peter is going to put our website URL in the chat for all of you, but it's basically pubpronetwork.org. Really excited about the book show. It should be really fun. Then in next year in April, we're going to be once again having our annual conference at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. And that also, fingers crossed, is going to be an in-person event. Later on this month, on the 27th, I believe it is, we're having our first joint picnic, with Bay Whip, which is Bay Area Women in Publishing, also in Berkeley. I've been talking about all these things that are happening here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I do want to point out that PPN is actually a national organization. People do join it from actually sometimes even around the world. And so just because we're having in-person events in the Bay Area, I hope that won't deter you from joining us, because we're really going to be doing quite a few things virtually. Every month on the third Thursday, we have a social meetup, which is really fun. We really is just a time to get together. We often discuss things around publishing, but it's not limited to that. It's really just a time to connect and sort of be all about community. Okay, it's 5:35. I don't want to spend any more time on anything except the subject at hand, because I'm really excited about it. A lot of us have been really stressed once we heard about the fact that Postscript Type 1 fonts were going away. We didn't really know what that meant. And so we're really fortunate tonight to have Thomas Phinney, who is an expert in many areas of typography, background at Adobe, but also has this wonderful thing that you can see, Font Detective, in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. He can talk a little bit about that, but forensics of typography, to talk about forged documents. How cool is that? Really, the bio is on the Eventbrite page. You probably all read it. I don't want to get too far into it. Thomas can sort of share anything that he thinks is relevant about his background to what he's going to be talking about tonight. But for now, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let Thomas take it over. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Hi, I'm Thomas Phinney. And first, of course, thanks to the Publishing Professionals Network at pubpronetwork.org for inviting me to do this talk. Second, I'll apologize now just once for my cold. I'm mostly over it, but still slightly snuffly. Not COVID, yay. So yeah, could be worse. And so this presentation, actually, as someone noticed in chat, I think, is set in one of my typefaces, Hypatia Sans. That's an Adobe original I created when I was at Adobe, which was from 1997 to 2008. By the end of my time at Adobe, I was the product manager for fonts and typography. Since then, I've done product management at Extensis. I, for a while, was CEO of FontLab, making font editors such as the titular FontLab, and some other apps, one of which we'll talk about later. And most recently, I've been solo doing font forensic work and producing variable icon fonts for Google. So I've been intimately involved with fonts and font formats for 25 years now. I've met an amazing number of extremely smart and talented people, and really nice people too, actually, of whom a good 30 or so signed up for this event. I don't know how many of them are actually here because, of course, there's some die off there, but yeah. Anyhow, so in my time here, I was one of the people, one of many folks involved who led Adobe's move to OpenType, which was also planting the seeds of the end of Type 1. I don't mean to say I'm the one and only expert on this. I, as I said, made the mistake of reviewing who registered to attend for this talk. It included at least 4 people who were manager of some version of Adobe's type group at one time or another. Several other managers and staff from different parts of Adobe Type, quite a few font industry experts, and a bunch of experts from related areas such as PDF and printing. So I'm really sure we're going to have an active discussion at the end, and no doubt I will be making a few corrections and clarifications. So here's an agenda for this evening. I'm going to talk about OpenType and why it and TrueType are replacing Type 1, including why does Adobe even feel a need to get rid of Type 1 at all? It is not at this point because of a desire to promote OpenType. That would have been a reason back in the early to mid 2000s, but not now. Then we'll talk about how support is going away and what we know about that. Also about what's not changing, where the old fonts will still work for a long time to come. And finally, what you can do to change over. So from their introduction in 1984 with Postscript, past the end of the 90s, Postscript Type 1 fonts were the dominant flavor of fonts for professional publishing. Now, that said, there was an interesting problem, which some of us call the font wars. On September 19th, 1989, Bill Gates announced at the Siebel Publishing Conference that Microsoft had partnered with Apple on a new competing technology, TrueType, which had actually been developed by Apple, but somehow Microsoft got to announce it. Don't know. This would soon offer scalable fonts on screen as well as in print for the first time for general use. Adobe co-founder John Warnock came to the podium after this with literal tears in his eyes, called TrueType the biggest bunch of garbage and snake oil. And that introduction was the beginning of the font wars of the early 90s. Passions were pretty strong for many people on both sides. Interestingly, in response to the TrueType announcement, but before it actually shipped, in October of 1989, Adobe introduced a system utility first for Mac called Adobe Type Manager that would scale Type 1 fonts on screen. Again, on-screen part was new before it had just been for printers. To work in any app and for output by almost any printer, instead of their use being restricted to specialized PostScript devices. The Windows version came out in June of 1990. TrueType now saw its first support in May of 1991 in Mac System 7 and April 92 in Windows 3.1. But that said, I am going to skip all the turbulence and angst of the early 90s. I'm going to skip to another very particular date, March 7th, 1996. Adobe's Bill McCoy went to Redmond and met with Microsoft's Bill Hill and some others in room 2165 of Microsoft Building 27 South. Without rat-holing on a lot of details, web fonts and lack of system-level support for Type 1 were being discussed, but the meeting wasn't making a lot of progress. Finally, Bill Hill and from Microsoft and Bill McCoy from Adobe left the building and took a walk in the nearby woods around the Microsoft campus in Redmond and talked about what it would take to really bury the hatchet and what they could possibly accomplish and how they could do it. I think they discussed at least taking some of the general structures and methods from Microsoft's TrueType Open initiative and adding support for the outlines and hints of Type 1 and being open to other advanced typography features. Within 2 weeks, a draft letter of intent was circulating. And this deal was approved at the highest levels, including by Bill Gates personally, like while his daughter was being born, if I recall correctly. It was signed on May the 4th, which some people call Star Wars Day, and announced 2 days later on May 6th, 1996. Now, Bill McCoy was not part of Adobe's type group as such. He was actually the designated Adobe person responsible for the Adobe Microsoft relationship. And surprisingly, most, possibly all of the staff of the Adobe type group were unaware of the deal until the announcement. McCoy had kept them in the dark. Now, that said, after they recovered from the initial shock, there was a general current of approval. Everybody pretty quickly came around to thinking, yeah, that's a good idea. Stunning, but not a bad idea. So I joined Adobe in June of 97, at the time in just an intro role in the type group. But funny thing, I soon found myself trying to unravel some very gnarly problems with Postscript Type 1 fonts. It was a freaking nightmare just trying to extend Type 1 fonts to cover all Central European languages when they had to also coordinate with printer drivers and fonts baked into the printers as well. It was a really complex end-to-end problem. It took months and months to resolve, delaying the shipping of the first Postscript 3 printers. Now, let's flip ahead. Several years later, in a newly formalized role as program manager for Western fonts, I was the primary sort of schemer in terms of exactly how and why and in what general ways we would go around converting the Adobe type library from Postscript Type 1 to OpenType, a project I codenamed Alchemy. And it was right around then that I first tried to broach what turned out to be an unthinkable topic. How long would Adobe continue to sell Type 1 fonts? And even less important in my mind, I was hoping to get rid of the selling sooner because that would indicate, a strong pivot and show our support for OpenType. But, also the question of supporting them. I thought it'd be a great idea to stick a stake in the ground and declare at least the selling date or possibly both future end dates. At the very least, stop selling them as a sign that they weren't going to be there forever. So just pointing out, so the date on this blog post is October 2005. So you can see I was already bald 17 years ago. Oh, and also Adobe was already officially warning people about Type 1 fonts going away back in 2005. Now, while I honestly believed we could phase out sales of Type 1 fonts, some folks were less certain of the success of OpenType. We're not ready to do that. Plus, cutting off Type 1 sales in the early or mid 2000s would have meant less money. And, end users, those who are skeptical of OpenType, particularly Adobe's brand new OTF flavor as opposed to TTF, might choose to buy fonts elsewhere. Of course, TrueType TTF fonts were also OpenType, but those were not the kind Adobe was making. As I recall, it was Dan Mills, who was then head of the type department, that put the kibosh on the idea 19 or 20 years ago when I first brought it up. I think he said it was just way too early. And looking back now, I think he was right. Although I will certainly argue that they waited way too long to halt sales of Type 1. Not support, but sales. Now, the reasons many of us wanted to get rid of Type 1, myself included, feel free to blame me for part of this if you want, is that it just has many limitations that OpenType doesn't have. It's a long list. You have different files on Mac and Windows, inconsistent platform-specific encodings. So there were different, even though the fonts had all the same glyphs, you couldn't access all of them on both platforms. On Mac, it required a resource fork, leading to file system issues. With normal Type 1 fonts, as opposed to CID keyed, there's a max of 256 encoded glyphs, which is, by modern standards, laughable. And there's a need to have a standard encoding, so you couldn't just put arbitrary stuff in a Type 1 font and expect it to work. Or if you did, you'd have to lie about what that stuff was. So you get crazy things like, the FI and FL ligatures and the FFI and FFL, were encoded as cap V through cap Z. So if you were manually sticking in fancy ligatures, it broke spell check, among other things. And God help you if you changed fonts for that whole word, because then you'd get office turning into, OWCE or something. So it was bad. And of course, you didn't have any of the smart font features. Wasn't Unicode encoded, and the multiple files per font, plus those files being platform specific, so you couldn't move the fonts around between platforms. Good grief. And I'm sure there are more things that don't even come instantly to mind. Those are just the big ones. Now, of course, those limitations were generally removed in OpenType. And this last point here, more encoded glyphs, more code points, Unicode, smart font features. Now, that smart font features is important for two reasons. Yes, one is advanced typography in general, like automatic use of fancy ligatures or easy access to alternate glyphs, and having them relate to the base glyphs so that those ligatures don't break the text. But the same mechanisms that enable fancy typesetting for Western languages are used to enable just basic functionality needed for other writing systems. I'm going to throw up a quick timeline here. There's a lot of random dates. You'll notice that in this whole phasing out, it was back in 1999 when Adobe announced discontinuing the multiple master flavor of Type 1. For people like me who did my master's thesis on multiple master fonts, that was a particularly bitter thing. Plus, they were just cool and super useful especially for, even when we stopped making multiple master fonts, we still used multiple master in the background for design purposes because it was a more efficient way just to create all the separate weights, for instance. Couple other things on this list. 2005, MPEG made OpenType a standard as the open font format, which is sort of synced with OpenType. OpenType came up with color fonts initially, and sadly, there still are 4 different flavors of color fonts. It's bad enough that there are 2 kinds of outlines, but 4 different kinds of ways of doing color in OpenType. You got to be kidding me. And the reason is that color was kind of an afterthought. Everybody's like, oh, we kind of need to do emoji and we should have a system emoji font or what have you, but this isn't really important and not such a big deal that we ought to worry about dealing with other people's stuff. And so they didn't. Everybody had their own version. They all came out at about the same time, and it all ended up in the spec, and it was a big mess, which sucks. But on the plus side, that is a big part of why when multiple master fonts essentially came back as OpenType variations, which, to be fair, is not actually technically based on multiple master. It's actually technically based on Apple's GX variations. That tech and the whole thing around that, everybody saw the mistakes they had just made, a year or two, year previous with color fonts ish. Obviously, longer time scales involved. And they said, gee, let's not do that again. And so the announcement of the OpenType variation stuff at the ATypI conference in Warsaw involved reps on stage at the same time from Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, and Google, all getting up and saying, yes, we're doing this and we're supporting this. And then, of course, you've got 2020 and the announcement that it was the end of 2020, I think, that the announcement that Type 1 was going to go away. And now, Photoshop has already dropped Type 1 support last year, and in January of next year, Illustrator and InDesign are slated to do so. Now, I will eventually deal with, I saw that question go by in chat, that, well, all this, you've put out some reasons why you would want something better than Type 1, but you haven't really explained why supporting Type 1 is a problem. And yes, we will get to that. Just saying. Well, sorry. I noticed the comment, someone has Type 3 fonts that they made back in the late 80s. Yeah, they don't work, or at least they are hard to make work. You can send them to the printer, but can't render them on screen. So why do Type 1 fonts have to die? What's wrong with them anyway? Well, here's Adobe's official statement about dropping Type 1 support. And it's actually pretty clear as far as it goes. Most browsers and mobile OSs do not support Type 1 fonts. Similarly to Adobe, most operating systems will move forward with support for the more robust technical possibilities of OpenType format fonts, ending support for the Type 1 format. So that's fairly clear as far as it goes. Let's break it down and talk about the one thing they don't mention. So first, you have the web and mobile devices, including tablets. Browsers and mobile operating systems don't support Type 1. Much of the growth in software is in these areas where Type 1 has never been supported. Now, it's reasonable to infer that Adobe has plans to do more in this space. Kind of like everyone else, this is not rocket science or shocking. The message certainly supports this idea. Already, the Adobe font service, what used to be Typekit, does not do Type 1, and nor does any browser-based platform. Now, I suppose in theory, okay, maybe a browser-based app could roll its own support somehow, but I can't imagine why anyone would bother at this point, trying to roll their own support from scratch for Type 1. That would be weird. They would find better ways to support their time, or to use their time and effort. So let's talk about future OS support. Now that's one interesting thing to me anyway. Adobe's statement would seem to suggest that Windows and/or Mac support is going away. Of course, if it wasn't already going away, it could be that in discussing their plans to drop support, Adobe themselves could have triggered someone else like Microsoft or Apple to do so as well. That would make some sense. That wouldn't be crazy. It's like, well, if Adobe's not going to support it, why should we? Now, beyond that, I want to say that what I'm about to say is rampant speculation. I know nothing, just paying attention to past behavior and speculating a wee bit here. Windows has already failed to support Type 1 natively in all of their APIs since the original GDI. So, GDI Plus, Windows Presentation Foundation, etc. That's a lost cause, nothing new there. On the other hand, they have continued to support GDI forever so far. Part of me imagines I'm going to be long dead before they drop GDI. But again, maybe they'll be emboldened by Adobe dropping Type 1 first. Could be, I suppose. Maybe not. Now, Mac OS, on the other hand, has a very different track record when it comes to dropping support for things like old APIs. Apple has always been willing to break things in order to move forwards. So if Adobe is hinting an operating system is ending support real soon now, I, for one, rather imagine it could well be Apple who's playing that part. This could be true whether they started on their own or whether they started doing so in response to Adobe talking to them about it. Either way, neither of those possibilities would shock me in the least. And then we have the third part of this, which is something much more narrow, but also highly useful. It is something that Adobe did not mention in their statement, but seems to me to be an important part of the story, as I have gathered by doing some research and checking various sources, including public sources, that InDesign, Illustrator, and Photoshop And I assume quite possibly more Adobe apps I don't know about have started adopting this, and it doesn't work with type 1. No, I didn't make phone calls. There's actually evidence of this in public stuff online. I may have also had some chats with people. This is also true, but only because I noticed this first. And I was like, wait a minute. It's called Harfbuzz. Now, I predict that a fairly large percentage of you are going off and that Google searches for Harfbuzz are spiking at this moment. Or you might just wait for me to explain what the hell Harfbuzz is. Will it help if I tell you that if you translate the words open and type into Persian, it sounds a lot like harf and buzz? Interesting, but doesn't really tell you a damn thing, does it? So what is Harfbuzz? Why does it matter? And how on earth can it not supporting type 1 fonts be a decisive element in dropping type 1 support? Now, before I tell you what it is, first off, why would Harfbuzz choose to drop type 1 support? Well, Harfbuzz reached its first general release in 2015, almost 20 years after OpenType was announced and 18 years after Adobe stopped shipping new type 1 fonts. And it's mostly focused around some things that can't be done with type 1. So you can imagine that its developer did not consider type 1 a priority. Plus, only supporting OpenType and TrueType means avoiding all sorts of issues around type 1 fonts, as discussed earlier. So it's not that Harfbuzz dropped type 1 support, it's that it never had it. So the real thing you want to know is, what is Harfbuzz and why would anyone need it? So I'm going to quote from the Harfbuzz GitHub repo. Harfbuzz is a text shaping engine. Give Harfbuzz a font and a string containing a sequence of Unicode code points. Harfbuzz selects and positions the corresponding glyphs from the font, which is not necessarily one-to-one, by the way, applying all the necessary layout rules and font features. Harfbuzz then returns the string to you in the form that is correctly arranged for the language and writing system. Harfbuzz can properly shape all of the world's major writing systems. It runs on all major operating systems and software platforms, and it supports, quotes, the major font formats in use today. Now, I'm going to go over this a little more because honestly, if I didn't already know what text shaping was, I would still not necessarily quite get why this is a big deal and why you would need some third-party open source library to do it. So text shaping is the process of translating a string of character codes, Unicode, into this arranged sequence of glyphs that can be rendered on screen or into final output or included in a PDF or whatever. Now, that shaping process is dependent on the input string, the active font, the script or writing system, that is, that the string is in, and the language within that writing system the string is in. Now, this might sound like it's no big deal, but text shaping can be very, very complicated. It can involve rearranging the order of the glyphs relative to their input characters, glyphs that change form, form ligatures and complex relationships, marks that attach to base glyphs or to other marks. And it just gets more and more complicated. Things can move around in all directions, and the behaviors can depend on context in pretty complicated ways. Some writing systems do some pretty complicated things in terms of getting the right shaping. And I see, because of the groups I hang out in, I see discussions about obscure shaping behaviors all the time. It's very eye-opening if you've never been there. So here, for instance, we have some basic text engine behavior for Arabic. First line is displayed left to right, but of course, Arabic has the opposite character order, so the glyphs have to be ordered right to left. And the same glyph has different shapes based on word position, and it's even a little more complicated than that. So here's the string in the wrong order, here's the string in the right order, and that's what actually renders from that same string of characters. And you'll notice it only looks vaguely similar to the string above, right? And Arabic is one of the complex writing systems out there. Arabic's one of the simpler ones. Some of them are way more complicated. Most of the Indic writing systems are noticeably more complex than Arabic, for example. And of course, Tibetan, oh, God help us, makes the Indic writing systems look simple. Persian, by the way, is also written using the same writing system as Arabic. And that's why if, for instance, you were of Persian descent, you might care about this stuff. And thus the literal Persian translation of the word OpenType is pronounced something like Harfbuzz. And the developer being Persian is, part of how the library got its name. That's Bedad Esfabad. Now, so that is, and Arabic's just the tip of the iceberg. Devanagari, similar thing. You've got 3 separate characters, and I don't think I've shaped that as well as I could have, but this just sort of glues them together. But here you see that that one vertical stroke has gone away. It's complicated. This is turning into rat hole. I could show you Tibetan as well. But oops, and we're going to just skip a slide because I was thinking of doing Tibetan and didn't. So that's the story. You've got all these apps that are adopting the ability to do complex writing systems. And one of the easiest ways and most sane ways for them to do that, instead of Adobe started doing a bunch of their own code for complex writing systems. But it appears to me, as far as I can tell, that at some point they realized, what's a nice way of putting it, that was dumb, and that there was open source stuff that would do this. And one of the costs of that, though, is that code doesn't do type 1. It just doesn't. Could you extend the code to do type 1? Theoretically, I'm sure. Would Bedad accept that into his main existing branch of the code? I doubt it. I haven't asked him. I probably should. But again, that's this cost benefit thing. This is just a big chunk of extra work that would have been needed if you want to keep on supporting type 1. And given the other things, I view it, I'm not saying that this is like the single only reason or anything. It's just, there are plenty of reasons. And I think that was just another one. It may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, as far as if you wanted to point at a single reason. I don't know what this means in the long run. One thing I'll say is that from my point of view, personally, I think it's dumb to have separate versions of apps for complex writing systems. In general, most of the people in those countries don't have more money than the people in the West. They have typically less. So the idea that, I can see how you could get away with, charging people more for the version of InDesign that does extra fancy Japanese features, but to just do, basic typesetting for Bengali or something, or Arabic, I'm like, this is not, it's a large number of people you're serving. It's a big market in that sense, but it's not like these people have gobs of money. And, instead of, integrating everything, having a single universal code base seems like a sensible thing to me. Now, of course, this may be why I got out of product management and got back into making fonts and stuff, because I hate that particular kind of bean counting thinking that I may sometimes serve the customers more poorly in favor of making more money. And just to respond, someone was saying, I still don't understand why they couldn't leave existing support. The code is already there. Yes, but only if you're going to have a modal system where you have one mode where type 1 fonts work and complex writing systems don't, and you have a different mode where type 1 fonts don't work and complex writing systems do. I submit that it's not an insane decision to think that you don't want to force that kind of modality. And I find that kind of modality kind of dumb and frustrating, especially when sometimes people want to mix certain writing systems in the same document. And yeah. We'll talk more about a couple of these things. So what are the various pieces of all this? What's happening when? What's dropping support? Where is support sticking around for the near future? So some apps and environments have already dropped support, like Photoshop, October of last year. I'll point out there are some apps, in the open source community, LibreOffice and Inkscape, they wanted to use Harfbuzz. And so, LibreOffice dropped support back in 2017 for Type 1. Now, OpenOffice, I think, still does use it. And also last year, I'm not sure if this is exactly correct. Oops, I meant to edit this. I am told by at least one source that Big Sur doesn't do it for font access over a network. But this may have to do with the whole resource fork thing, and it may have to do with exactly what kind of network it is and such. So there are also things that never had support. So Windows APIs later than GDI, GDI Plus, WPF, Direct Write, Harfbuzz we've talked about, and of course, most web browsers, certainly all current web browsers, as far as I'm aware. And it may be that there are some really old ones that at one point had it. Broke support, but it came back. Word 2013 for Windows broke support for Type 1, although it was fixed in Word 2016 and Word 365. Mac OS had one release at one point a couple years ago where they broke Type 1 support, and the next dot, a couple months later, it came back. Let's talk about what's not changing. I'm seeing that in the chat already. So displaying and printing of embedded fonts. So for fonts embedded in existing PDFs and fonts embedded in EPS files and so on, those embedded fonts in the documents will still be displayed and printed, at least by Acrobat, and I'm sure by other things as well. And in fact, internally, the way Acrobat embeds Type 1 fonts is actually as Type 2, also known as CFF, which is in fact the same way that PostScript-ish fonts are stored inside at least the initial version of PostScript flavored OpenType. So from a PDF perspective, it's almost the same thing. So that's all well and good, but remember, that's only for the existing documents, but not new authoring and not editing those files. So the problem would be that you wouldn't be able to edit those files using the same font. You get the same kind of situation as if you try and edit one of those documents without the font. You'd have to change it to another font. Now, if you happen to have an OpenType equivalent, it might be a little bit of a pain, but you could probably work through it. And of course, support won't break if you don't upgrade. Mind you, that might include your OS as well. Maybe its support won't break if you don't upgrade anything, not just your apps, but also your OS. Now, the problem with not upgrading is, of course, security-related stuff. I think all of us know that unless you want to keep something around in a corner off the internet and not using it for general work, you can't leave stuff around indefinitely and not update it. Or at least you have to be very careful about how you do it. So that said, the writing's on the wall. And if you were trying to just keep your operating system up to date, if they stop supporting Type 1, OS activation of the fonts won't work. Now, it's interesting. Adobe said, and I quote, previous versions of Creative Cloud apps will not be able to support Type 1 fonts once support is ended for the operating system. Now, that surprised me because Adobe's CoolType API, used by a lot of their apps, is completely capable of enumerating and using fonts from Adobe-controlled locations that bypass the OS entirely. We know that to be true because that's how the private Adobe fonts folders work and how Adobe loads fonts in the same folder as an InDesign file. On the other hand, if, for example, Apple stopped supporting the old classic Mac resource fork at all at the file system level, that would really break things. So that's another reason that, I could see type 1 getting pretty thoroughly borked, at least for that OS and later. And it would literally potentially break the font files. Like, if it might be that you could get a point at which if you moved to a file system that didn't support the resource fork on OS, I'm getting a little fuzzy on the details, one way or another, you could actually literally break the files. And I'm sure a lot of us have at some point experienced what happened when you move type 1 fonts to Windows and back, Mac type 1 fonts to Windows and back, and you ended up with 0-byte files, and it was a mess. So that's what I think is one of the more likely scenarios here, and that would be a problem. It just makes them more fragile. Can you still hold out? Okay, yeah, I guess it's technically possible to keep old hardware and operating systems around for years, and everybody around you encourages upgrades, and you're going to have fewer people to exchange data with, right? But in theory, you could do it. Keep on running InDesign CS6 forever. Hardware will eventually die and get hard to replace. Talked about hacks and security issues, but I will say, if I was in a pickle on this, I might keep some old hardware in a different corner of my office here for a few old files and so on for a while. Let's talk about transitioning. For most of us, we're going to need to transition sooner or later. And even if you don't transition everything, even if you do try and keep the stuff up, it may be in your interest to try and transition what you can. So first, you want to survey what fonts you have. You need to find all your type 1 fonts. You may have a font management app, of course, and it may be very trivial to do. A lot of the font management apps can, just do a filter. On a Mac, you can do a search for kind, just type kind, go into the Finder thing, do a search and type kind : LWFN font. Away you go. Windows, you got a .pfb and pfm for each font. So search for one of those file extensions. .pfb in particular, that's the outline file. So once you know what they are, transitioning from those type 1 fonts means one of two things: convert or upgrade. Either by convert, I mean converting them ourselves versus getting upgraded fonts from the source. And now, let's talk about converting. So this is like homebrew conversions. It has some potential issues. This is the cheapest option if it's legal. Now, the number one question, does the license agreement, or EULA, allow it? Adobe's own license agreement that Adobe applied to fonts sold by Adobe, like the Adobe type library, which included fonts licensed from Monotype and Linotype and so on, ITC. Adobe's EULA did allow this kind of conversion, as I understand it. Open source licenses, of course, allow conversion. In general, most other licenses do not explicitly allow it. Monotype certainly doesn't in any version I've seen. Assuming you have fonts that you are legally allowed to convert, what the hell would you use? TransType from FontLab. You may have heard me mention them earlier. $97. TransType is a very capable app, and I am happy to recommend it. Not perfect, but pretty user-friendly, and also has a few nice advanced features, like allows you to regroup font families as needed, establishing those style linking relationships. Font Exchange from FontGear is the main other desktop app. Now you notice that I am not talking about, there are many web-based apps, and I'll get to that in a moment. Oops, how did I have two of the same slide? So note that if you're converting Mac type 1 fonts, it's very easy to lose the resource fork if any other platforms involved, and that includes the web. So for example, the online converters I tried could not cope with Mac type 1, presumably for this reason. On the desktop, you generally can't move the files to Windows. The only exception I know is if you take Mac type 1 fonts and put them in a zip archive, when you're still on the Mac, you can move that zip archive to Windows, and the Windows version of TransType can convert Mac Type 1 fonts if they're in a zip, which is an interesting and clever little workaround. Now, also, if you are dealing with the Windows Type 1 fonts, there's some data that kind of has to be made up. Because of style linking, the full style names are not really there. It can be possible to get them from the full font name. I wouldn't want to guarantee that I will always do the right thing. So the main thing you have is the big issue with your homebrew conversions is that your converted fonts may not be the same as other people's converted fonts who converted some other way. Other people's converted fonts converted on a different platform. People who converted a different version, which is mainly important for things like, it was only at the very end of the life of Type 1, at least from Adobe's point of view, that they added Euro symbols to the fonts. So the chances are, even though Adobe did eventually add the Euros, well, it happened in the late 90s. That's when the Euro happened. Does your particular Type 1 font have a Euro? I wouldn't bet on it. And especially, they're likely not the same as a foundry's own conversions. So let's look at how a foundry might have converted their fonts, or in this case, did convert their fonts. I'm going to use Adobe as a case study for 3 reasons. First, they're pretty common fonts. Second, I know exactly what they did because I was the lead of a whole bunch of people working very hard to do that conversion. And third, we know that at least Adobe's license for these fonts, if you got an Adobe license, gives you the right to convert the fonts yourself. I don't even know, and maybe someone can fill me in here, if the situation is different if you licensed it from, say, MyFonts or Monotype or Linotype, which back in the day were 3 different companies. I realize they're all part of the Monotype empire now, but they weren't in the 90s. Oh yeah, sorry. I just saw Dan's comment about why Adobe didn't just build a conversion tool or recommend specific other ones. We actually had an internal tool that people could drag and drop on for conversion, but there were a bunch of reasons. It was both the legal concerns that Dan mentioned, but also that we were doing our own conversions at Adobe. And as you'll see in a second, we really want people to have our versions because of the Euro symbol and a bunch of other things. So Adobe's own in-house conversions added some symbols, Euro, estimated, and liter, and 14 Mac symbol substitution characters. They extended kerning to more accented characters if it wasn't already covered. They merged supplemental fonts and added the OpenType features to support that. So expert sets, alts, titlings, if those existed, they all got merged in. And that's still fonts with a standard name. It doesn't have to be pro to have OpenType features. Added auto feature code for the FI and FL ligatures that weren't anything. Now, one of the interesting things is the symbol, dingbat, and pi fonts in general got re-encoded using the actual code points for those, using the real Unicode code points, which is on the one hand the totally true and correct, morally right Unicode thing to do. It's the reason that some of the few Type 1 fonts I carefully saved were those fonts, because if you had an old document, it would be a pain to convert that. But because of things like, if you used any of those symbol substitution characters, they wouldn't necessarily have the same width. Adding kerning to accented characters in some cases could cause those characters to flow slightly differently. So as someone pointed out, at least with some of their documents, they had issues where they could get text reflow, and that is totally plausible. Or, maybe you have a particular sequence of letters like FFI, meaning the ligature just automatically gets kicked in unless you go out of your way to turn it off, which is lovely, but that might be just a slightly different width than those separate characters, could cause reflow. So it could happen. And that's why Adobe never guaranteed that these things would be compatible with the old versions. Symbol substitution characters, which used to be generic. They'd literally get substituted from symbol. And this was only true on Mac. So this was another way in which the Mac versions of these fonts were incompatible with the Windows ones. Symbol substitution characters were these 14 characters, and here you see them in some different weights in this font. So when converting to OpenType, Adobe replaced the totally generic ones with font-specific versions. The Adobe Originals got handmade ones for non-Adobe Originals that were synthesized from multiple master, sans, and serif fonts to match the weight, width, and slant of the font they were added to. Jerry Hall and I came up with a process for that. There were even some patents, which have since expired relatively recently, just in the last couple of years. So upgrading, purchasing, just have to contact all your individual foundries for upgrade pricing. I was shocked at how little information I found online about this. And I thought about contacting a whole bunch of foundries. It'd be interesting for those. There are a few foundry representatives here on this call. I would love to see them chime in about whether their particular foundry offers upgrade pricing. In general, though, you have to contact folks because, what are the odds you actually even have the license yourself or have proof of purchase from something you got 20 plus years ago? I don't have my email and computers from back then. I've been pretty good about saving email for quite a while now, but not that far back. So proof of licensing may be difficult. And I'm sure a lot of folks don't offer upgrades, but can't hurt to ask. So that's the question. Now, if you upgrade, do the fonts have the same names? In Adobe's case, we chose to rename the fonts. I believe in most cases, most companies have done so. And that means that even if you did take an existing document, you would have to, do search and replace on fonts to map them over, which could be a bit of a pain, but at least ensures that you don't get a reflow without having done something on purpose. So that is everything I wanted to talk about. I'm happy to take questions. I should point out that we have quite a few highly knowledgeable people here in the audience. Two that I will single out are both former managers of font development at Adobe, Dan Radigan, and who was intimately involved in making these decisions we see playing out now, and David Lemon, who was there at the beginning of this and making decisions during the conversion. Now, so I'm sure some of these folks may have comments or corrections they would like to make. And that said, please be aware we had nearly 300 people register for this. So if you have questions, please use the chat window to ask them via text. But if you want to speak, or if I or somebody else asks you for a verbal comment, please raise your hand using the Zoom mechanism to do that so our hosts can unmute your microphone.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, this is Dave Peaty again from Publishing Professionals Network. Thank you for that amazing, at least for me, deep dive into how we got to where we are now. I know that a lot of people are going to have questions about ways that they can move forward, but you've definitely covered some of that. So thank you so much for coming to our rescue. I'm going to let you kind of peruse the chat and see if there are things that you can quickly answer. I know that coming from the book publishing world, a huge part of the discussions that have been going on at Publishing Professional Networks is not only how do we sort of get fonts converted or buy upgrade fonts, but also how do we take a super long, complicated book that we have to go back to making a some small changes to without the entire book reflowing. That's a huge thing that we struggle with. Are there ways, for instance, to convert so that somehow it's all going to render as it did before? And I think the short answer is probably no, but I'll...
You can't guarantee it is the short answer. You could Adobe in general was reasonably conservative, but didn't shy away from making improvements. Most of that, though, is in some pretty obscure stuff, the symbol substitution characters or accented characters. If you're talking a long book in English and it's not a technical book, like a novel or something, there's a pretty fair chance that you might not have any reflow. That said, it's freaking complicated. And when we were doing this, David, I remember long conversations about, could we guarantee, if we wanted to, even if we wanted to, could we really guarantee no reflow? And we couldn't. It wasn't freaking possible. David, you're unmuted if you want to say anything.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And it's the risk of reflow. We didn't try to make it any more than necessary, but the risk was an important part of the price to pay for improvements.
Yeah. And once we decided that, yes, there was going to be some risk of reflow, we couldn't avoid it. That led to a cascading series of decisions. Okay, we can't avoid the risk of reflow completely. So we should change the font names, by adding standard or pro. If we're going to do all that, then perhaps we should go ahead and do some minor improvements that typically won't cause reflow in places where they would be really nice to have. So that's the thinking that went behind that at the time. I remember it well because those were long conversations.
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes anyone else feel any better, but we agonized over that stuff. We really did. And I'm just for the Adobe side of it. I'm not speaking for anyone else, but yeah, it was painful.
I will say that somebody in chat kind of jokingly suggested that you were taking responsibility for promoting the death of Type 1.
Oh, yeah.
And I will say that I was totally there.
I wasn't the only one.
Yeah, going to OpenType, part of our thought process was, at some point we can get rid of Type 1, because one of the things that most people don't realize is that the application teams at Adobe were spending inordinate amount of time tweaking their code bases to better handle buggy Type 1 fonts. And this was helping very few people and wasting a whole lot of cycles. And it was like, the world, at some point, the world has to move on. And I know that comes at the cost of some fonts that simply can't be replaced or upgraded. And that does suck. I'm sorry, but I think it was important.
Yeah. So I'm curious, one of the people most intimately involved with some of these end of life decisions is here on the call. Dan, are you interested in commenting at all? Someone want to unmute Dan Radigan? It's like the fourth line down in my display, about the 15th. There you go. You're unmuted.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically tasked with getting consensus for this to happen at Adobe. So I effectively was convinced by a couple of people it was a good idea, then I had to try to convince everyone else that it made sense. And so I feel really bad when people are upset about it, because I was one of the people who really knew that it was going to upset some people. Part of the concern is there was quite a lot of data showing that it's a very, very small number of users who were still working with Type 1 fonts. The app teams could see that. And one of the big issues from Adobe's perspective, what drove this, you're spot on about the Harfbuzz concern kicking all of this off, because it was the Photoshop who was moving in that direction first and was very concerned about the text processing. And so the discussion spiraled out from there. And the two big things internally aside from Harfbuzz, where it's, you know, it's an engineering cost to keep figuring out workarounds for all these, you know, other features like better language processing, better, you know, better language handling, to have to get type 1 to work within that. But also there's this big strategic move in the Creative Cloud for documents to get shared through the cloud and through those sort of interstitial services like Adobe Font that don't handle type 1 fonts. So there's this growing dependence in the overall product suite on sharing documents through these spaces and using these services that could do nothing with type 1 fonts. So it was and part of the hope was that of giving sort of a 2-year warning time was to give people a chance to make plans about what to do and decide, did they want to look at conversion? Did they want to look at switching to OpenType versions of fonts? Did they need to review documents? We tried to make it longer than one annual budget cycle, at least.
Cool. And I noticed also we have Christopher on the call, unless he just dropped out. Christopher Sly.
We've got the next hand up is David Blattner.
Well, I'd also love to hear from David.
This is
You did.
great, Thomas. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. I think for a lot of us, one of the biggest concerns may be something that you cannot answer, which is what will technically happen in the Adobe apps, not in InDesign specifically, on whatever it is, January 1st.
I'm pointing at Dan. Let's see. From my point of view, it looks like he's down there.
Because
So-
is it going to be the version, like when we upgrade to the next version, InDesign 2023, or will it literally be a time bomb?
It'll be for the versions of the cloud apps that for the updates that get pushed around January 2023. Any type 1 fonts referred to in your documents will come up as with a missing fonts error. Those fonts will effectively be invisible to the software with the update that gets pushed out around then.
Thank you. I know that one of the things that I've encountered is I've talked to folks who have gone back to certain type foundries and you know, raised the issue, what do I do? And those foundries actually, once they could prove that they actually had bought the type 1 font from them, sent them for free the OpenType version. And I'm wondering if there can be a move to urge other type foundries to say, like, this is a great way to enable customer, you know, loyalty to offer this kind of thing. Who knows? I saw someone holding up a sign, but I wasn't sure what.
Yeah, no, I'd seen Doug's comment earlier, and I have to admit that I don't. So why don't can you unmute Doug Milhoff there? But I'll try and answer your question, and then you can clarify if I'm not doing it well enough. Hi. So your concern is, hey, why you're saying this is modal? So the existing InDesign, for instance, does have very modal text engines, and it is true that if you're in sort of, you know, Arabic, you know, you set which layout manager you want to use, and if you use the one for Arabic, then you can do stuff, and if you don't, then you can't. One of the nice things in theory about that some apps may want to do when using something like Harfbuzz is just have it on all the time. So currently some of the apps are very modal. I was arguing that this is bad, for one thing. If you have your modalities too complicated, it can mean things like, gee, I can set Arabic or Japanese, but I can't use them in the same document, or in the same text, you know, text frame or whatever. And that seems problematic to me. I may be in a sort of weird world there because I have to deal with a lot of global stuff. But so that's the thing. I mean, so one, I think folks probably sensibly, I hope they want to move towards using one layout engine all the time. And if they do, and they're using Harfbuzz, then they would be in a world where they just couldn't access type 1, or at least that would be the simplest way for them to go. It may not be the only way. It would be simpler and more elegant and arguably better in the long run, is my thinking on that. I don't know. Dan, do you want to comment on that?
Is the reason to drop the modality that's the problem itself?
The modality is dumb, is what I'm saying. It's there for partly because they're afraid of breaking existing documents, and partly because in some cases they were hoping to, there were other parties involved in selling separate versions of apps that were enabled for certain markets.
And in a multi-language, increasingly multi-language world, it's causing more trouble than support is solving. Okay.
That's what I'm arguing. Yeah. I don't know if Dan or Christopher or David has some other perspective on that. Yeah. Christopher, you agree with me here? Yeah.
Part of the thinking about the importance of moving to Harfbuzz instead of the various writing system engines developed in-house at Adobe is that it's more engineering intensive to like keep updating all that internal stuff as bugs gets reported. It's endless bug chasing. With Harfbuzz, where there's a big community of people looking at it, the code is getting updated regularly, and it can be brought into the apps as needed after it's been reviewed.
Right.
So, and it also,
and you're going to get support. Sorry, go ahead.
At least some more consistent results. And I mean, the East Asian languages will be an outlier for still a long time, but Harfbuzz really solved a whole bunch of problems. I remember being at a talk years ago, Thomas, where someone in the audience just outright accused Adobe of being racist because it couldn't support a lot of these writing systems. And you were explaining then how big an engineering lift it was to try to handle that.
Yeah. And what excites me about something like Harfbuzz is because it's open source and community driven with a very wide base of people involved, people from communities where, InDesign and InDesign's never going to make an appearance in terms of local sales because they don't have the money for that. These are often third world countries who have some pretty interesting obscure languages, but for the open source stuff, there are people involved from those communities who are eager to engage with the open source community, bring their expertise to bear, and help people like Harfbuzz create the solutions. And if they do that, if Adobe is using Harfbuzz, they get that stuff essentially for free, which is pretty cool for writing systems and languages that otherwise, in a lot of cases, there would be no economic basis for Adobe on its own to perhaps ever support them. Like it wouldn't make economic sense. And I, for one, am excited about that because, I've been involved with the international typography community for a long time now. And it's a big deal. It excites me and makes me happy and almost brings tears to my eyes thinking about the fact that this, in the long run, is going to get all sorts of minority languages and writing systems supported that in these apps that might otherwise never happened.
Thank you. I know that one of the things that came up at one point was about sort of for the librarians in all of us, really. Is there any risk? Are we going to potentially, sort of lose important historical content as we kind of make this transition? And I think that's a legitimate question, especially in sort of where those things exist in areas that don't have a lot of financial resources to make the conversions and things like that.
Well, there will be exceptions where, stuff, God help you if you're using some of these type 1 dingbat fonts and somewhere down the road, we lose track of the encoding of that, and that's hard to research or something. But aside from those kinds of issues, in terms of just general texts and so on, it's, the only thing that's getting broken is the exact details of layout, right? And only if you want to open up the old source document. This isn't going to affect PDFs. So if the documents in question are available in PDF and you're talking about accessing that, you're fine. We're only talking about, sort of going back to non-PDF source files and trying to edit documents and have nothing whatsoever change. There are certainly some things that there will, I'm sure, be some very particular things that get busted or become problematic to retrieve because they did something like they used, they made very important use of dingbat fonts in some particular way, and God help them. But aside from some, what seemed to me like real corner cases, I don't see this making anything inaccessible. It means that if you need to bring some old document forward and have its line layout exactly the same, in some cases, the layout might have to be tweaked or something. Yeah. But it's not like the data goes away or becomes inaccessible in almost any of these cases. I have a lot more worry with that kind of thing about file formats where the file becomes unreadable. Are we still going to be able to open your InDesign, InDesign 6 file or CS6, 20 years from now? I don't know, but I wouldn't want to bet on it. And I'm a lot more worried about that than will your font get replaced or will you need to replace the font?
Well, we're at about an hour and 15 minutes or so. We're probably sort of going to wind things down. Some folks have had to go. I just want to remind folks, if you have any last minute questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them in the next few minutes. But thank you so much to Thomas Phinney for putting this presentation together, and for his cohorts who are willing to speak up about their experience in where we are getting to where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to remind people that Publishing Professionals Network, all volunteer nonprofit working to serve the publishing community. We hope that you will come and join us. We do plan other professional development episodes like this one. Specifically, for instance, we're very interested in the whole issue of Pantones and the Creative Cloud and how that's going to ultimately play out and how we can navigate that as well. It's all about us being here to support each other and to help bring in experts who know about this stuff, but also we as a community talking about the things that the hurdles that we've overcome and some of the problems that we've run into as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Saul. One last thought. I just want to say, it seems to me that one thing that would be super helpful to end users would be if you had scripts available that could help you migrate documents from set of fonts A to set of fonts B. And I think that would be very exciting. And there may be some opportunity for either some of the app vendors or some other folks involved to solve that problem, or at least make that transition easier that way. And that will be an interesting topic for maybe some online discussion after this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Again, you can sign up to be on our mailing list to hear about the upcoming professional development sessions at pubpronetwork.org. You can be a member, but you can get on that mailing list. You don't have to be a member to be on it. And we'd love to have you join in future sessions. So thank you so much. And as I said, this is being recorded. We will put the recording up on our YouTube channel, and we'll send it out to everyone who signed up on the Eventbrite list, as well as posting it up on our website. Thank you so much for coming and participating in this. I'm going to save the chat, and we'll try to glean some of the good stuff in that and send it out as well. Thank you.
Right. Thanks all. Bye for now.